Let's talk about static. And I don't mean static like this, or like this. I mean the static keyword in Java, which is used to indicate that a member belongs to the class and not to the instance. And before we continue, I'd like to give another tough topic warning. This topic is typically hard to understand for beginners, so please do not worry if this one is hard for you to wrap your head around. This is normal and it will become logical to you eventually if you stick with it. I promise. So before I go back to static, I want to repeat the difference between classes and instances. A class is a blueprint. It contains things that define the actual objects. And an object, also called instance, is the actual embodiment of an object of that class. Alright, so back to static. In Java, the static keyword is used to indicate that a member belongs to the class itself and not to an instance. And it might be hard to wrap your head around, so let's look at a non-code example. If we look at the blueprint of the houses will all have the same architect. This is the person who made the blueprint. Arguably, the architect belongs to the blueprint and not to the instance. Even if there are no instances of the house built, the architect will be the architect of the design or blueprint. And let's look at another code example. Let's say your friend is going to get a puppy. At this point, your friend doesn't have the instance of the puppy just yet, but there are some things you can do for the puppy before it arrives. In Java terms, things you can do, methods, that do not depend on the instance, because you don't need the actual puppy just yet. For example, you could buy the puppy a toy, but you cannot walk the puppy yet. This method really belongs to the instance. In other words, you need a puppy for this. So getting things for the puppy can be considered static. And walking the puppy can be considered non-static. We need the instance to be able to do this. Having static members means that you can access and modify static members without having to create an object of the class. Here's an example of how to use the static keyword on a field. We say public static int x. So a static field is a class member that is shared by all the instances of the class. To access and modify the value of x, we could write something like this. We can go myClass.x directly, so we do not need to create an instance. We can also have static methods. Here's an example. We have public static void print message. To call this method, we don't need an instance. We can call it directly on the class, so myClass.printMessage. The static keyword is used to indicate that the member belongs to the class itself and not to any instance of the class. This can be useful when you want to define a member that's shared by all the instances, or when you want to define a nested class that does not depend on the outer class. And then I want to make an important side note again, and that's that these static members are not associated with any particular instance of a class, so they cannot access or modify the non-static fields or methods of the class. Non-static members, on the other hand, can access and modify both static and non-static members of the class. And this is because we cannot access the non-static context from a static context. For all we know, it's not there. Think of the example of the houses. We can't be sure there's a front door when we talk about the blueprint and an architect, because maybe the house is not being built just yet. In general, it's a good best practice to use static members sparingly, as they can make your code more difficult to understand and maintain. However, they can be useful and a clean solution in certain situations, such as when you want to define utility methods or constants that are used throughout your program. Let's have a look at some examples of static in the next video.